Hi, Midnight Shadows. My name is Kamau, and this is my story. The strip club had become my escape, a place where I could lose myself in fantasy and forget the pressures of daily life. I had a regular girl I talked to. Her stage name was Foxy. She knew how to make me feel special, and over time, our conversations had become a routine I looked forward to. Tonight, Foxy seemed particularly cheerful, and I settled into our usual booth, feeling the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. We chatted and laughed, her presence relieving my stressed mind. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere changed. A tall, muscular man entered the club, his eyes scanning the room with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Foxy's smile vanished when she saw him, and she excused herself quickly. I watched her go, wondering what was going on. Minutes later, the man approached our booth. His eyes locked onto me. "Are you Kamau?" he asked, his voice filled with hate. "Yes, I am," I replied, "and stay away from Foxy, she's mine." Before I could respond, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. My heart skipped in my chest, and the club fell into silence. He aimed the weapon at me, and everything slowed down. I saw a flash of green light and felt a pain explode in my stomach. The world around me faded as I fell backward, but as my body hit the ground, I felt an odd sensation of falling forward, into an abyss. At first, there was complete darkness, the kind that you can almost touch. Then it was the smell of sulfur. Some compare it to rotten eggs, and they are right. Then there was the heat. It was suffocating. There was no air to breathe, just nothingness. The darkness was alive, filled with a bad energy. It wrapped around me, squeezing the life out of every hope I had ever held. The darkness was not just an absence of light, but a real force that seemed to whisper despair and eternal torment. The smell of sulfur grew stronger, burning my nose and making my eyes water. The heat was unbearable, burning my skin and making it impossible to breathe. In that void, I felt utterly alone and yet surrounded by the cries and screams of countless souls. The noise of suffering was overwhelming, a chorus of pain and regret. Every scream was a testament to a life of missed opportunities and wrong choices. The realization hit me hard. These were people just like me, trapped in an endless nightmare of their own making. You're watching Midnight Shadows. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now, let's get back to the story. I walked through this barren landscape, my steps heavy and my heart pounding. I came upon a vast field of thorns. People were impaled on the sharp spikes, their bodies twisting in agony. The thorns tore at their flesh, and their blood flowed freely, mixing with the ash on the ground. Their screams filled the air, a chilling reminder of the pain and suffering that awaited me. As I continued to walk, I saw a massive iron gate. Beyond it lay a dark, twisted city. The buildings were crumbling and decayed, their windows shattered and their walls covered in drawings. Fires burned in the streets, and the sky above was filled with black clouds. The city was alive with the sounds of suffering and despair. I entered the city, my fear growing with each step. The streets were filled with people, their faces twisted in pain and their bodies covered in wounds. They walked aimlessly, their eyes vacant and their spirits broken. Demons prowled the streets, their eyes glowing with hatred. They tormented the souls, laughing as they inflicted pain and suffering. In the center of the city, I saw a tall, huge tower. Its walls were made of black stone, and its windows glowed with an unnatural red light. I felt a powerful pull, drawing me toward the tower. I knew that whatever awaited me inside would be even worse than what I had already experienced, but I couldn't resist the pull. I entered the tower, my body trembling with fear. Inside, I found myself in a huge room filled with instruments of torture. Chains hung from the walls, and the floor was stained with blood. In the center of the room, a massive demon sat on a throne of bones, its eyes fixed on me. It grinned, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The demon stood and approached me, its footsteps echoing through the room. It reached out and grabbed me, its claws digging into my flesh. The pain was unbearable, and I screamed in agony. The demon laughed, a deep sound that shook me to my core. The demon dragged me to a table and strapped me down. It began to torture me, its claws slicing through my skin and its teeth tearing at my flesh. The pain was unlike anything I had ever felt, a constant, unrelenting pain that consumed my entire being. I could hear the screams of other souls, their pain mingling with mine in a chorus of suffering. As the demon continued to torture me, I felt a deep sense of hopelessness. I knew that there was no escape from this place, no end to the pain and suffering. I was trapped in hell, condemned to an eternity of torment and despair. In the midst of this torment, I remembered the faces of my family, my wife and my son. I had betrayed their trust, lived a double life, and now I was paying the ultimate price. I realized that every lie, every deceitful act had brought me here. The weight of my guilt was suffocating, but it was also clear. In that moment of absolute despair, I understood the true cost of my sins. Meanwhile, back on Earth, chaos erupted at the strip club. The man who had shot me had fled the scene, leaving behind a trail of panic and confusion. People screamed and scrambled for cover as the club's security rushed to the scene. Within minutes, the police and an ambulance were called. The paramedics arrived quickly, finding me lying on the floor, bleeding heavily. They worked fast to stabilize me, applying pressure to my wounds to try to stop the bleeding. I was alive but losing a lot of blood. The paramedics loaded me onto an ambulance and rushed me to the nearest hospital. The ride to the hospital was a blur. The paramedics kept talking to me, urging me to stay awake, but I felt myself slipping away. The pain was intense, and I could feel my strength fading. At some point, they say that my pulse stopped. When we arrived at the hospital, the emergency room staff took over. Doctors and nurses worked frantically, trying to save my life. They pumped my chest, trying to restart my heart, but there was no response. My condition was critical and time was running out. Back at the strip club, the police were doing their best to piece together what had happened. Witnesses gave their statements, describing the shooter and the chaos that had followed. They worked quickly, hoping to catch the man who had done this before he could hurt anyone else. At the hospital, the doctors finally had to stop. There was no pulse, and they couldn't get my heart to start again. They declared me deceased and began the grim task of informing my family. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. I felt a force pulling me back, lifting me out of the darkness. I slammed back into my body, gasping for breath, my eyes snapping open to the bright lights of a hospital room. Nurses and doctors were around me, their faces pale with shock. I had been deceased for 4 minutes and 30 seconds, but to me it felt like an eternity. The experience left me forever changed. The terror, the despair, the utter hopelessness of that place haunted my every waking moment. I knew I had been given a second chance, a chance to change, to find redemption, and I would not waste it. I started by getting involved with local support groups and rehabilitation centers. I reached out to the youth, many of whom were struggling with the same issues I once faced. I shared my story, not just the parts about my addiction and my secret life, but the terrifying glimpse of hell that had shaken me to my core. I've learned that while we can't undo our past mistakes, we can use them to build a better future for ourselves and for those around us. And with every story I share, I hope to inspire others to find their own path to redemption. And that, my dear listeners, concludes today's story. If you have any advice for our guest, please share it in the comments section below. If you have a similar story you'd like to share, you can send it to us at the email on your screen. Until next time, beware of the shadows that linger in the night.